Hello and welcome. My name is Bolid Mayer. I am a Microsoft technical trainer here to walk through the Microsoft SC-300 Identity and Access Administrator Associate course with you. Every day, cybercriminals are searching for ways to compromise your organization, not by breaking down the firewalls, but by targeting identities. What if you could spot suspicious sign-ins, detect leaked credentials, and automatically block risky users before they become a threat? That's the power of identity protection in Microsoft Entra ID. In this session, you'll discover how the risk detection, automated response, and real-time insights help you stay ahead of the attackers and keep your users and your data secure. So let's get started. Entra Identity Protection is an amazing feature that's available within Entra, where it can help you evaluate in real time risks that could be associated to your users or your sign-ins. Now you can see all these as reports in your environment once you've configured them, and we'll have a look at them a bit later on. Typically, these risks are rated from low, medium, or high, depending on the type of risk that's been detected by the system. And there are different common types of risks that you can find that are listed on the screen. However, if you want to know a little bit more about some of these to understand what exactly would the identity protection pick, then let's jump onto the Learn documentation to have a quick overview of some of these details. I'm back onto the Learn documentation using learn.microsoft.com, and I am going to simply type in identity protection and hit enter. Now, all I'm looking for is a documentation that tells me a little bit more about Entra Identity Protection, and we'll go into that document. Now, this document is a good read if you're new to identity protection to understand how it works. Now, just for us today, we are simply going to scroll down into the bottom of this to understand a few things before we start working with our identity protection in our environments. Now, one of the key things before we start working within this with this tool or the solution is that you would require different types of roles before we start working with this. Some of these roles are listed on the screen that are good to be aware of. Now, typically your global administrator that has the highest level of access in your environment, they should be able to, by default, read only access to all the identity protection details. So they should be able to read all the reports that are coming out of this in terms of the solution. Now, the problem with that is they cannot write into the identity protection. So who should be able to then create these identity protection policies for me and configure them? Well, in that case, we'll need to come further down in here to look at our security administrator. Now, security administrator by default has full access to creating these policies and configuring identity protection solution for me in my environment. However, there is one small area that the security administrator can't perform, and this is resetting a user password. Now, why would I need to reset a user password? We'll come back to that a bit later. However, if I did need someone to reset a user password, in that case, I would look at a role in my Entra called user administrator that can have that ability or would have that ability to reset user passwords. And they can read, they can't read or write into identity protection. So again, a separate role to do a particular task, but nothing directly to do with identity protection. Apart from my security administrator, we are always going to look at implementing zero trust in our security settings. So we are going to look at the least privilege access in this case as well to assign right role to the right people so they can do things that they need to perform as part of their job role. I could look at security operator role. Now, the security operator role could be someone who needs access to all the reports that are coming through, and they need to go and take certain actions as a result of what the reports are showing them. So they can remediate some of those actions. Things like dismiss a risk or approve things are compromised and so on. However, the security operator cannot configure these policies or reset a password or configure an alert for me. One last thing that we have here, if I just want someone to be able to read the policies or the risks that are coming back as a result of these policies, I could assign them a security reader role, which gives them access to reading everything to do with my identity protection. However, they can't perform any of the other tasks that we mentioned already with other roles that were available. There is another role that's listed over here, a role for conditional access administrator. What's conditional access has got to do with this? Well, we'll talk a little bit later more about how we can use identity protection within the conditional access policies. So if someone is configuring them, then in that case, there would need to be at least a conditional access administrator to be able to create these policies as part of the identity protection, but configured within conditional access. So we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. Now, apart from understanding the roles, there is a license requirement as well for this. Now, for us to be able to implement identity protection in our environment, we're required to have an identity protection or Entra ID P2 license. This feature doesn't work for free or is not available for P1 users. So again, something interesting to be aware of. Now, apart from all of that, once you have the right license and you have the right roles implemented, the next part would be to understand what are the risk detections that this particular solution picks up for me. And here on this document, we have a few of these listed, and further down the document, there's a lot more detail that's provided around these risks. For instance, if I was to pick up a few from here just to talk about, these are these are sign-in risk detections. Again, this is where it can pick up if an activity was performed from an anonymous IP addresses. Now, there are many IP addresses that are well-known IP addresses in the world, maybe related to a particular ISP. So you can find out who or where the IP address is coming from or where does it belong. However, there are others that are anonymous. So if somebody is logging in using an anonymous IP address, maybe you want to create a policy for them or associate a risk to them to suggest, hey, this is a risk for me in my environment. So systems should be able to detect that and associate a risk level to them. Now, apart from that, we can pick up some other details, things like we have atypical travel, something that is unlikely for someone in your organization to do. So travel to a part of the world or a country that they've never been to before, or a new country could be another risk. Again, these might not necessarily be a medium or high level risks. They could be a low-level risk because it could be that a user from your organization has traveled to a new country and they're just signing in. So it could be some of that. However, still something that you can consider as a risk associated to a sign-in happening from a different country or a different location. There's one more in here called the impossible travel, which is an interesting one, simply because the system is clever enough to understand that a user has just recently signed in. Let's assume a user sitting on their device signs in from, let's assume UK. And an hour later, they then sign in from USA. Now, again, I suppose till we have time portals to travel through or the portals to get to travel across the globe, that travel is pretty much impossible unless we get a better transport system from UK to US in an hour. So the system straight away picks that up and suggests, hey, there's a risk associated to this sign-in because this sign-in happened an hour ago from UK. It's impossible that this user has traveled to US within an hour. So it can't be real. So it, again, raises that particular issue to tell you there's a risk against this sign-in right now. Something that can very commonly happen in your environments, simply because imagine while I'm logged into my resource in UK, I open up a browser, and in the browser I type in azure.com or portal.azure.com and run a virtual machine in that, and that virtual machine might be based in the US. While I'm logged into that virtual machine, I authenticate myself to a service in here. Now that is where it can see that I am logging into a virtual machine, but my sign-in is happening in US, and that could trigger this particular type of risk associated to my account. Again, the level of that might not be medium or high, might be a little low, but it could trigger that as a sign-in risk detection. There are many others, something like password spray attack and others that you could look at on the list. There is, however, another type of risk detection that identity protection performs, and that's to do with user risks. If your user accounts are compromised or in somewhat way visible for others to look at. So it picks up some of those details over here. Things like leaked credentials. Someone has taken your username and password and published it on a website, maybe on a dark web or somewhere else. Now, working with Microsoft security solutions and with other security providers that Microsoft collaborates with, they can pick some of this information up and then raise a risk against their user account. Now, this is where we can see the user is at risk because their account details are available for everyone to look at. Or we could look at some other suspicious activities, things like attacker in the middle attack, some resource in between your user and end service is pretending to be the middle person, trying to get the data or trying to do the replay attack in between to take your packets and replay them back to your service. And when the response comes back, they replay them back to you. If they're doing something like that, this is something that it can also detect as a risk to the user and can rate that. Now, for both of these types of risks, if there's a risk but where the system thinks that there is a sign-in that could be malicious, now typically an easiest way around to remediate that is, hey, Entra is not sure if this is you signing in, we want to verify. The easiest way we could say, all right, no problem, ask the user to MFA. So the user will be triggered for a multi-factor authentication. If they can verify that, so maybe we know it's them. They're just using a different country, a new location. They've gone to do the impossible travel by jumping VPNs or whatever to log into a new part of a new location. As long as they verify it, that still, again, triggers an information in the report that this user was triggered under this alert, and they successfully signed in. So it tells you that information as well. Whereas if I'm looking at a user that's at risk, in that case, we know that this user is very likely compromised. Their password is available somewhere or something is happening in between. So very likely their account is now compromised. The best thing that we can do for a user risk is to ask the user to reset their password. Hence, talking about earlier on when we said roles defined, the security administrator can't reset password. So if I'm going to ask this user to reset their password, as a security administrator, I can't, but the user administrator can. They can reset the password for this user. In that case, the risk for their account being compromised drops down a little, simply because now we know at least whoever had access to their account no longer can log in simply because the password has been updated. So this is, again, a very, very nice document to look at. Again, if you scroll further down, it explains all of these in much, much more detail. So a very nice place to have a look at this and do a quick read on what these risks are, just to get your head around and understanding how they would work in your environment. For us, let's jump back onto the portal and start configuring some of these. All right, I'm back onto my portal at Entra Admin Center using entra.microsoft.com. On the blade, I'm simply going to scroll down to the bottom of the screen where it says Identity Protection as a tab. Now, within Identity Protection, let's have a look at the dashboard to begin with. I have a few options I can configure in here. Now, currently, I can see as a quick overview, there's not necessarily much happening in my demo environment with regards to the identity protection. However, for us, the key focus right now is how do I go create the policies? Bearing in mind that you have the right roles assigned before you can start doing this, because if you don't have the right policy, you might not be able to see some of these options available for you to configure. Now, to start with, let's start with user risk policy. Now, in here, I can start creating a policy for user risk. If I know the user account is compromised, I can simply come in here and configure this. Now, if you have seen one of the previous videos on conditional access, this might look very similar to you. As understanding of this is what I'm defining if this matches, then in that case, we are looking at a response. So this is like an if and then part of the policy. So you can see if these match, then go and take an action. So what is my if part? In this case, we're looking for assignment. We can define for all users, define for some users. Just be very careful if you leave this for all users, not to block yourself out, or if you're creating big glass accounts, make sure to exclude them from these policies as well. Now, for now, I'll leave it as all users. I'm not going to block myself, but we could. We can define the risk level. So if in my entire Entra directory, all users have any risk level associated to them, things like low and above, that means low, medium, and high, then in that case, this policy applies to them. Now, this policy currently suggests that they will be blocked access as long as the user has some level of risk associated to them. They're not going to be able to log in. Now, the easiest way to resolve that is just blocking them access. You can say, hey, let me allow you access to this. However, because you have a risk associated to your account, at the next login, you'll be required to reset your password. So this is, again, a couple of options that we have that we can configure as part of my use the risk policy. Now, the sign risk policy doesn't look much different to this. So if I go into sign in risk policy, same process. I can define user, I can define group of users, I can select individuals, I can exclude some of the people from in here. So it's a choice I have. I'll leave it as it is for now. Again, we can choose the risk level. We could say low, medium, or high. We can choose medium and above. We can do high. So you choose. Maybe I don't want to block people if they are at a low risk, but if they're medium or high risk, I want to block them. So you choose what works for you best. I'll leave it as it is, low, medium, or high. Any risk associated to your sign-in, I want to take an action. Again, in this case, we could say we'll block your access because you have a risk associated to it, reduce the risk, or someone to remove the risk before you can gain access. That could be your admins doing that. Or you simply taking an action against whatever is required. But I could change that to say, let's allow this user access, given they remediate some of that. In this case, because this is a sign-in, we can ask them to do MFA. If they do MFA successfully, we'll let them log it. So again, these are some of the policies that we can create in here. Now, one very important thing to understand is this. Under my identity protection policies that I have, I am limited with one policy for user risk and one policy for sign-in risk. I can't create multiple policies for any one of them. Along with that, I don't have any additional options to add to this. For instance, if I want to say, if this user has low risk and they're within the office, let them log in. But if they're outside, block them. So again, I don't have those options in here to configure under my assignments. That's why if you look at the very top of the screen does suggest that we recommend you to use conditional access policies to configure your identity protection. It has some of these options available within. So it's ideal to go into conditional access policies and implement them from there. As a very quick overview, I will show you where they're available under conditional access. So if I click on conditional access and go into one of the policies that we created in one of the other videos, by all means, if you haven't seen my previous video on conditional access, please go and have a look at that. In this, if I go under the conditions very quickly, you can see the user risks available for me here, and the sign-in risk is available for me here as well. Now, again, I could create them both in one policy. Ideally, I should create them in separate policies because the remediation for both of them is different. And under my grant options here, I can simply go and define that, hey, require this user to do multi-factor authentication. Again, that is if their sign-in is risky, or if I need them to reset their password, I can choose the password reset option from here if the user is at risk or their account is compromised. Now, within this, I can add a lot of other options to suggest particular type of application or resource, or go into defining a network and create multiple policies for that. If you're on this network, then you're okay. If you're not, then maybe something else should apply. So again, you have some flexibility using conditional access policies if you are creating your identity protection in your environment. Now, apart from the configuration of your identity protection, what can I do as a security administrator or security operator when there is an actual risk listed? Typically, you'll see your risk reports that will show you this information over here. Now I can simply go into my risky users to find out if there is a user that is at risk, and we have a user that's at risk called Daniel Phillip. Now this user, if I look carefully, has some details telling me this user is at risk, there's a high risk associated to them, they belong to DevOps department. Obviously, these are details that's picking up from my Entra and user profile and bringing that information to me. Now, typically, if I go into checking their recent sign-in attempts, now this data for sign-ins typically lasts in your environment for 90 days. Now, if this particular attempt was prior to 90 days, I won't see any sign-in attempts from here. Now, obviously, if this is an active environment, you might see a lot more other sign-ins, and you can see the ones that were risky, and they will be all listed in here. By default, in Entra, the sign-in logs are kept for 30 days. Just because you're using identity protection and using P2 license, this particular feature allows you to see the sign-ins for up to 90 days. If you need to retain them for longer, then you need to go and export them out directly. You won't be able to retain them from in here directly like this. Now, apart from looking at their sign-ins, if I have any other data around this, maybe a risk history to find out what actually happened. This was a password spray attack that happened a while back. Now, because this has happened a while back, I can see that I don't have the sign-in data for it, but I can still see the risk associated to this. Now, a few things to bear in mind. The risk detection that it does, it shows me that, or for the risky users, this data is unlimited time period stays in your system. So I can see that again and again. So lucky enough for me today, I'm able to demonstrate that I have a risky user that's in my environment, but their risky sign-ins are not visible because I don't have any attempts that happened to my environment within the last 90 days. Otherwise, we should be able to see that. Now, as a result of this, I should be able to take certain actions. These actions are listed on the screen over here. Now you can see the reset password is visible for me to work with, and that is only because I have a user administrator role assigned to me at the moment. That's why I can see the reset password. Otherwise, this is grayed out for security administrator, security operators. They can't see this at all. However, for the rest of the actions that I have in here, these actions can be performed by security administrators or security operators in your environment, so they can take action on these. Now, security readers can see this information. They can't perform any of these actions. So you can go into looking at, hey, confirm this user is compromised, or confirm the user is safe, dismiss user risk. Now, this is something I was talking about before. When I'm creating a policy, if I say block user access, as long as they have risk, let's block their access. So this user comes back and says, hey, I can't log in, I have a risk associated to my account. You, as a security operator or security administrator, go in here and dismiss the user risk, and that drops the risk for the user down, and the user is able to log in. Or you could simply create a policy that suggests that user goes and takes an action, either MFA or reset their password, and they're good to go back into their account. Or you can simply go and block user right from here, rather than going into user account and blocking them from accessing this. Now, apart from looking at the risky users, we could have seen risky sign-ins, but I don't necessarily have a data for risky sign-ins in here. Typically, the data is correlated between if the sign was risky and a user account is now compromised. We should be able to see both of them under risky users. But if they were just risky sign-ins, they should be visible for us in here, and we can filter this data down from here. And again, like I said, typically this data that you have in this environment, it stays here for a limited period of time. So the risky users would stay for unlimited period of time. The risky sign-in stays for only 90 days. So you can export the data out for my risky sign-ins from right here if I needed to take it out and either store it somewhere in the storage or push it into another security tool that will then help me analyze data further. So I could do that, some of that from in here. And with that, we come to end for the session. We encourage you to review the reference modules, check your knowledge with the additional study materials, watch other videos in this course, or search out your next favorite topic on Microsoft Learn at aka.ms/learn. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.